It's fair to say that I devote a lot of time and energy to analyzing new developments in US defense programs, particularly aviation efforts like the Air Force's Next Generation Air Dominance and B-21 Raider. But throughout my coverage of these and similar programs, one question appears in the comments on social media and YouTube more than any other. Why am I revealing the details about these secretive programs to America's enemies? Let's dive into this question. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. The question, why are you talking about this, is something defense journalists get asked pretty often, especially online. And to be honest with you, a lot of them tend to respond with rolled eyes. That dismissiveness may, in some cases, have something to do with irresponsibility, but more often than not, it's based on a thorough understanding of the US defense apparatus and of the role the media plays in geopolitical discourse. From the outside looking in, though, it's honestly a pretty reasonable question. After all, national competitors like China, Russia, Iran, and others all have access to the same internet that we do, or at least their intelligence agencies do, and surely these nations can leverage the information and analysis presented by writers like me to inform their response to America's defense efforts. And to be honest with you, one thing is certain: they're definitely paying attention. If you search for my name on Google while specifying Russian domains or .ru, you'll get a long list of Russian-based news outlets discussing my analysis of things like their Su-57 Felon 5th-generation fighter. You can also find discussions about my work on Chinese media as well, and it's not like I'm a big deal or someone the whole world would be paying attention to. So, if we know that nations like Russia and China are paying attention to our coverage of stealth programs, and we're aware that Russia and China's own stealth efforts are lagging behind America's, I can understand why a lot of Americans would prefer if we kept our coverage of these systems vague, and kept the details of these programs out of the hands of nations who might mean us harm. But here's the thing. The details that defense outlets like ours report on are provided to us by the Department of Defense themselves, or from their contractors who are working directly with them, and it's all done intentionally. Let me explain why. By my count, there are at least 5 reasons why the Department of Defense releases information on even some highly classified defense programs. The first and most obvious among them being that these efforts are funded directly by the American people themselves. Every F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, every F-22 Raptor, or spy satellite, or XM-1147 Advanced Multi-Purpose Tank round that the US military has laying around was paid for with taxpayer dollars. And as such, the Department of Defense tries, to some extent, to keep the taxpayer informed about what they're getting for their investment. Now, this isn't just about showing your average American what they're paying for. To some extent, it's also about accountability. And I know that some of you just blew coffee out your nose when I said that. The idea that the Pentagon really cares about fiscal accountability just doesn't jive with other hot-button issues, like how the Defense Department has never passed an audit. But the truth is, defense officials really are held accountable for their expenditures by the Pentagon brass, in no small part because there's just never enough money to go around to fund all the big defense programs going on. But just beyond that initial level of accountability comes the next reason the DoD releases information about these programs, and that's that they're subject to pressure from the DoD's political leadership in elected office. And that's where public perception, or your opinion, becomes incredibly important. And I realize that might be the second time I've made you spit your coffee out, but I really do mean it. Your opinion is genuinely important. Programs like the F-35, with repeated delays and cost overruns, seem like pretty conspicuous proof that the Pentagon doesn't care what you think, especially when they're wasteful with your money. But the truth is, the F-35 is actually a great example of how public opinion really does change the military acquisition process. After all the very public blowback surrounding the F-35's high costs, the DoD shifted its fighter acquisition strategy dramatically to ensure a similar spending debacle doesn't happen again. From splitting design, production, and sustainment contracts, to shifting to a new model that calls for cheaper, more frequent fighter programs that don't have to last a half century each, the US is developing new fighters in very different ways these days. Now, these changes were brought about by internal discussions about what went wrong with the F-35's acquisition process, but also came as a result of external pressure applied by popular opinion by way of media coverage and political discourse. Elected officials recognized the way Americans felt about the F-35 and in turn pressed the DoD to change its ways. America's military has civilian leadership for a reason, because the defense apparatus ultimately answers to the American people. The American people vote for lawmakers to represent them and their opinions in big decisions, and unpopular programs will often get the axe or see significant changes as a result. Now, these changes don't always manifest overnight, especially in politically insulated programs like the F-35, but we see the effect of that public perception in the follow-on programs, like we are now with the NGAD and F/A-XX. But it's important to remember that the American people aren't the only audience the DoD releases information about new fighters or bombers or warships or what have you to. When they release this info, they're also talking directly to their competitors. And that brings us to our next important reason for disclosure. Now, by now, we've already covered all of the Civics 101 reasons why the Defense Department and large and small contractors like Northrop Grumman or Lockheed Martin or Hermeus all release information to the public. But there's another important reason lurking just below the surface. You see, Uncle Sam wants his opponents to know what he's got in the works because that's the only way new weapons can be an effective deterrent for future aggression. America's current national defense strategy, or the overarching goals of America's military, is broken down into 4 priorities. Now pay close attention to the first word in each of these as I list them. Number 1, defending the homeland, paced to the growing multi-domain threat posed by China. Number 2, deterring strategic attacks against the United States, allies, and partners. Number 3, deterring aggression while being prepared to prevail in conflict when necessary, prioritizing the Chinese challenge in the Indo-Pacific and the Russian challenge in Europe. And number 4, building a resilient joint force and defense ecosystem. Now, as you probably would have expected, the very first word in the very first priority is defending. But the first word in both the second and third priorities is a different one, deterring. That's where the release of information about these programs and the ensuing media coverage become an important part of America's overall defense strategy, for better or worse. There's no doubt that secret weapons can be incredibly alluring and really effective in a fight because your opponent doesn't know how to counter them. And that tends to be the argument you'll see levied in the comment section below stories reporting on new defense technology. But there's one significant problem with that line of thinking. A secret weapon can only be useful when you're already at war. Let's put this into hypothetical terms. If America maintained a top-secret fleet of aircraft meant to overwhelm Chinese defenses that no one outside the Pentagon knew about, it would offer the US no real value until the terrible day that war began. But instead, by advertising these sorts of programs, releasing information to the media, discussing upcoming efforts, and disclosing advanced capabilities, the US is sending a very clear message to its competitors. Put simply, that message is, if you start a war, we're prepared to win it. Revealing details about the NGAD program's effort to pair crewed fighters with drone wingmen, or about the B-21 Raider potentially using advanced engines developed first for the F-35 to minimize its heat signature, all tells military officials in nations like Russia and China that the US is not only maintaining its lead in stealth technology, it may even be expanding it. These nations, which are more aware of the limitations of their own defensive capabilities than anyone, see these programs and how they line up with their own, and are forced to ask themselves some very tough questions. Could we stop those bombers from reaching our shores? Could we stop those fighters from taking our skies? Could we really win a fight with the US? And if we think that we could, what would it cost? Those questions and the brutal arithmetic that follows are powerful deterrents to war. The US has the largest defense budget, the most technologically advanced military apparatus, and the furthest reaching media of any nation on the planet. And these three things collectively work to convince the populations of other nations, including their lawmakers and defense officials, that America is a nation that's not to be trifled with. Let's use the F-22 Raptor as our example because it may be the most capable air superiority fighter ever to reach the skies, at least so far, but it's never had to prove it. From a strictly combat-focused mindset, that might seem like a waste of billions of dollars spent developing and building these jets. But from a deterrence standpoint, the F-22's reputation as a highly maneuverable stealth fighter, with a radar cross-section reportedly some 5,000 times smaller than Russia's best stealth jets, could be seen as a resounding success. Nobody wants to square off with America's mighty Raptor, if they can help it. Now, I don't personally buy into the idea that dogfighting is dead. I think that's something fighter pilots tell themselves because they've been flying air-to-ground missions for 20 years. But if it is dead, it's dead in no small part because insanely capable fighters like the F-22 killed it without ever firing a shot. That is the power of deterrence. But beyond just deterring the next conflict, disclosing new capabilities, technologies, and systems can also help force a shift in your opponent's priorities. China and Russia have heavily invested in hypersonic technologies in recent years, and although the US may now be the frontrunner in fielding some of the more advanced sorts of these weapons, public perception says America is behind. So the Pentagon is feeling pressure, some of which is placed on it by elected officials, to invest more heavily into this effort. That process works both ways, with nations like Russia and China working feverishly to develop comparable stealth technology, reusable spacecraft, integrated air defenses, nuclear reactors for warships, and more, all just to keep pace with what they know America's military capabilities already are. Their understanding of those capabilities are developed through a combination of espionage and, you guessed it, open source reporting, like you'll find in American media. Now, I've written articles before about how China manages to hide a great deal of its military spending behind domestic programs. But even when you consider that, and the difference in purchasing power parity between nations, which basically means China can spend less money to field similar things, the US still has more money in its spending pool than the competition. That's a problem for nations like Russia and China, who have to worry about global public perception of their military capabilities for the very same reasons America does: deterrence. China and Russia haven't developed their military modernization efforts in a vacuum. They've developed them with the US directly in their crosshairs, looking for vulnerabilities and then pouring resources into efforts that can leverage them. So when the US announces a new bomber program that can defeat even early warning radar systems designed to spot stealth aircraft, these nations are left with some hard budgetary choices to make. With only so many rubles to go around, do you prioritize developing your new offensive weapons, or are you forced to reassess your air defense capabilities in the face of America's new stealth platforms? If you can't beat the F-22, a design from 1997, what will it take to compete with the NGAD? But before we go, and I realize this conversation's getting kind of long, there is one more important thing that we should discuss, and that's that the US government is pretty good at keeping secrets when it needs to, or maybe wants to. The Pentagon may release information about its advanced new programs to the media intentionally to help guide American opinions and foreign perceptions and global awareness of America's military capabilities, but they certainly don't reveal everything. Considering the Air Force now has 6 of its newest stealth bombers, the B-21 Raider, at some stage of production, and they've even flown a full-size technology demonstrator from the NGAD program, we still don't even really know what some of these aircraft are going to look like. And these are programs we've been talking about for literally years now. Every year, the Defense Department budget gets passed with hundreds of billions of dollars allocated to various efforts all around the force. And within that larger pie, tens of billions are cut out for classified initiatives, hidden behind special access program security protocols. You'll often hear these funds referred to as the black budget. There are a lot of programs funded through these secretive lines of accounting. In fact, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute reported that in 2019, the DoD's budget included $81.1 billion for classified intelligence programs alone. In recent years, the Navy has filed patents for things like containerized cold fusion and plasma hologram projectors. Programs have been declassified that aimed to field flying submarines for Navy SEALs, and there were even discussions about space-time modification weapons that all found their way through the US government's declassification process. It makes you wonder, what kinds of weapons, systems, and capabilities remain hidden behind that shroud of classified funding? The truth is, we might never know. But in the meantime, don't worry about guys like me opining about the latest juicy details the Pentagon has revealed about its new fighters or bombers or tanks. Analysts like us may not always get things right, but in a real way, our coverage is all just part of the plan. And on that ends another edition of Air Power from Sandbox News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure you swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandbox News.